Argument synthesis. Alright, so this is a paper in which you're going to write an argument and you're going to use multiple sources. So the argument part of the argument synthesis is, obviously it's an argument paper. The synthesis, it just means that you're going to use multiple sources. So like for example a research paper would be a synthesis. Only in a research paper you choose the sources yourself as a researcher. You research them and you decide which ones are valid and helpful and useful, and you want to of course supply sources that argue both sides so that you're open-minded to multiple interpretations or multiple viewpoints. But in other syntheses you would be given the materials or given the sources. So like your book, for example, might have a section for synthesis, for a synthesis paper, in which there are, let's say, 10 sources supplied, and you decide which ones are best to use, or maybe you have to use them all. But if you use multiple sources, even if they're from the same book, in other words, pieces of literature or pieces of different articles by different authors, usually different authors, you use all of them or several of them into your paper, and if you do that, that's a synthesis. All right. So this one just happens to be an argument synthesis instead of, like, let's say maybe a literary analysis synthesis or some other type of synthesis. All right. So some things you need to be aware of and try to implement them well into your paper are argument strategies or persuasive strategies or rhetorical strategies. Persuasion and rhetoric are basically synonymous. They're about pretty much the same thing. When you persuade someone, you use rhetorical devices and rhetorical appeals in order to do so. You want to come across with sound, first of all with a point, and then you want to come across with sound evidence, trustworthy evidence. You want to gain the audience's trust so that they know that you are an ethical person. So you're using the ethical appeal in order to gain their trust and to provide the evidence as well. So provide trustworthy evidence, and you're being ethical. So that's one of the rhetorical appeals. It's ethos. That's Greek. It's a Greek term that we still use today in scholarly circles, and it's the same thing as saying ethical ethical appeal. So you of course need that evidence, and that could be evidence that are facts. Could be let's say expert testimony. So sometimes that evidence can be in the form of someone's opinion, but as long as it's an expert's opinion, someone that's already trusted on the issue, then that can be counted as evidence. Even though it's not a fact, it's still helpful in demonstrating that you are trustworthy. So when you draw from experts who are trusted in the field that you're writing about, you're giving yourself credibility, and you're showing the reader, in this case probably the professor, that you can be trusted because you're using trustworthy sources, and so your ethical appeal is strong. You've also got to use the logical appeal. It's called logos in Greek. Logos, logical appeal. And so when you're using the logical appeal, that's just when you're explaining your evidence and you're showing reason between sources or between ideas. So you're showing how that evidence is valid and related to your main claim or even a subclaim. So you want to certainly use the logical appeal in explaining the evidence and how it's logical, and explaining why it helps prove your point. There's some sections on inductive and deductive reasoning in our text, and it gets a little tricky but I think the main thing is that you're using sound reasoning. But also you might as well be aware that when you're using deductive reasoning, you are starting with a generalization and a specific case related to that generalization and a conclusion. So in other words, you have the claim, the support, and the assumption. So you start with a broad generalization and you narrow it down more and more as you use more specific evidence. You don't necessarily have to follow that exact structure. I do want you to start with the generalization. You want to start with your introduction that has some ideas. Whatever introduction strategy you want to use, there's lots of them that we have in our text, or a few of them at least, is fine. And you want to end with your thesis statement. So your thesis statement would probably be the most specific statement in your introduction. So that's kind of a deductive reasoning strategy right there. And then at that point, you're probably going to use the evidence and logic and throughout the rest of the body of the paper. And then you're going to conclude. The other strategy to structure your paper with would be an inductive strategy in which you start with the specifics. You're not necessarily supplying your thesis first. You're going to supply the evidence first in this strategy. I'm not recommending it really for at least not for our purposes and not for most of your classes that you would be taking. I do not recommend the inductive reasoning strategy in an essay, because really you want the instructor to know exactly what your point is going to be within the first paragraph, and if it's a really long paper, within the first 2 paragraphs maybe. But for the most part, within that first paragraph, by the end of the paragraph, you want to supply your thesis. So in an inductive strategy or organizational structure, you're not really going to do that. You're going to save your thesis until the very end. We do that with a deductive strategy, but we put our thesis in the beginning and the end. So the instructor or whoever the audience is knows what your point's going to be by the beginning, by the end of the beginning, right? And then you're confirming it throughout the paper with evidence and reasoning, and then you're including it in your conclusion at the end as well. So, but the inductive strategy basically starts with evidence, and as you supply all of the evidence, it would and reasoning, it would justify your thesis that comes at the end. But I didn't want to really emphasize the inductive strategy. I just wanted to make sure you're aware of what it kind of is, so what it is, and have a good idea what's meant when that's discussed. Okay, so let's go ahead and get into the structure options for your synthesis argument paper. And there's a couple of options, but I'm gonna suggest one of these options. Give me a moment. I need a sip of my drink. Okay. So I'll talk about the first option as one that I do not recommend, and that's the I had some notes on this. Give me a second. Just want to make sure you're. All right. So anyway, this is the strategy that I don't recommend again, but it's by source or by subject. You're organizing it by source or subject. So in either strategy, you're going to start with an introduction that introduces the paper and leads to the thesis. But in this strategy, after that, you've got the body of the paper, and you would summarize the first source. If you have let's say you only have 2 sources, right, and you're using a synthesis between, you have 2 sources that account for the whole synthesis. If you have 3 sources, you kind of do the same for all of them, but let's just say 2. So after the introduction, you summarize the first source, and then you summarize the second source, and you also start comparing and contrasting in that section. You try to show the differences between the 2 sources. And then you have a section that also discusses more of the significance between the points of source A and source B. And then you conclude. All right, so again, don't really suggest your structure by source. But I do suggest you structure your paper by criteria. And so what that means is that you have a set number of topics. So like when let's say you outline your paper, you're not going to outline it by, you're not going to put a section for one book and a section for another book in a separate section, because they both, especially if they both discuss the same topic, differences of opinion about the same topic, sure, but the same topic. No, what I do suggest this method for is because, excuse my the way I worded that, but I suggest the organization by criteria because you would have, let's say your subtopics of your thesis, and you would discuss what both sources say about your subtopic. So you'd introduce the essay, lead to the thesis, and then you start your body. Your first subtopic would be discussed starting with source A. What does source A say about this point? Okay, and then what does source B say about the same point in the same section of your paper? Maybe in the same paragraph. Maybe 2 paragraphs, one for source A, one for source B, but and then you want to, of course, start comparing and contrasting source B with source A. All right, and then you conclude. You have some, within that compare and contrast, you make a conclusion, and then you do the same thing with the next subtopic. So you would have a new point to make about your thesis, and you would discuss both sources. First, source A. What does source A say about the topic? Then what does source B say about the topic? And you do some comparing and contrasting between source B and source A, and you would make a conclusion. What are your thoughts? What's your reasoning behind choosing one method or the other, or maybe even having your own slightly different point of view after reviewing both source A and source B. And then you repeat it with a new subtopic, comparing both sources and concluding with your own thoughts about it until you've completed your comparison, until you've gone through all of the subtopics using both sources. Or if you're using more than 2 sources, using whatever sources apply to that subtopic. So sometimes 2 different sources don't have all of the same in common. You might have 3 sources that 2 of them discuss point A, point 1, and 2 different ones discuss point 2, and then a couple of them just randomly, I don't know how to put it, I guess maybe the first source and the last source discuss point 3. I mean, maybe you've got 3 or 4 sources, so they don't always, you don't always have to use every source for every paragraph, but you should, or for every section, but you should have at least 2 sources discussing every topic. So if you've got a body paragraph that discusses one topic, you should have at least 2 sources to discuss in that subtopic, in that body paragraph. And you compare and contrast what they say, and then you also add your own input or your own angle on it if yours is different than either of those 2 sources, or you side with one, perhaps. All right, so you do that until you complete the comparison, and then you do your conclusion. Okay, so happy writing.